Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this continuing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid. Welcome to a Tuesday edition of the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Today is the final day in the month of May. It is May 31st in the year 2016, the day after we celebrated Memorial Day. And tomorrow will be June 1st. We'll be moving into a new month. And for those, and I'm one who basically, acknowledge or believe that Memorial Day is really the beginning of summer, in spite of what the calendar says and the equinox and all the traditional things that happen on the 21st of June. The fact of the matter is, most people attribute the start of summer to Memorial Day, and here in West Virginia, that's when they tell you. Make sure you get beyond that before you begin to put up plants out, and hopefully you're beyond the kind of severe freeze that'll kill newly planted gardens and things. So, and again, our weather in the last couple of days pretty much tells us that summer is here. We've hit the kind of weather that all of us associate with summer as well, and it is absolutely gorgeous. I think we're supposed to get some rain later in the week, but it is gorgeous, and I, like everyone else, I watch the news, and I'm just appalled by the horrible weather that folks in East Texas are having with 16 inches of rain in 24 hours. My God, I can't even imagine what that would be like. I mean, we wouldn't come up for a year if that happened here. But anyway, I welcome you to today's program, and I thank you for your continued support of the Virtual Center and, of course, your continued support for Bob Kincaid and his folks at HeadOnRadioNetwork.com. It is a pleasure, as it always is, to be with you today. We began something yesterday that will be continuing through the program today, and maybe into a little bit of tomorrow's as well. It's one of those things that once you strike a match, so to speak, and a little bit of light begins to dawn on the subject, you begin to go this way and that way and another way, and begin to collect more and more information. And actually, it becomes a research project that very honestly tends to be its own reward. And I think yesterday's program, and the whole issue of looking at, much more critically at corporations has been such an issue for me. It has sparked the kind of research that basically has excited me, and I hope that I can convey a little bit of that excitement on today's program, so that perhaps you will be motivated or inclined to begin to look at a couple of sources we mentioned, and perhaps take on this kind of an issue and pursue it for yourself. We do have a phone number, and we use that number so that you can share your ideas, your thoughts, your concerns, your hopes and concerns and fears and all the rest of it with our listeners. Obviously, you'll be engaging directly with me, but the real issue, it seems to me, is to enlighten our other listeners. So I do encourage you to pick up the phone if you are so inclined, and take the opportunity to get on the air and share your thoughts and your ideas with other people. You'll learn a lot, and undoubtedly they will also. Our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. 304-663-4676. My email address, if you'd like to communicate your thoughts directly with me in an email, is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien, OBRIEN 906 at gmail.com. And I do encourage you to check out our Facebook page. I've been pretty active on it the last couple of days. I've posted 5 or 6 different things on the Facebook page, and I have a couple of Facebook pages. I have one devoted to the political campaign I'm engaged in, and then I have my personal page, and then I have the Virtual Center page. And usually I'll try to post what I put on there on at least 2 of those 3. So sometimes it becomes a little bit confusing because I can't make up my mind whether this is particularly campaign-oriented or whether it's something that I really want to engage my friends about, or whether, in fact, this is something that ought to have permanent residence on the Virtual Center Facebook page. But despite those internal conflicts, which shouldn't and hopefully don't worry you, the fact of the matter is I think that there's quite a bit of pretty good information on the Facebook page. I just posted an entry on it about an hour before we went on the air today, basically, and it deals with today's program a little bit. And it was intended to be kind of an hour before we were scheduled to go on the air. It was intended to be a little bit of a tease in the hope that there might be 4 or 5 folks out there who are going through Facebook that would take a look at this and say, I'm going to give that program a try today. And, it's because of that I put this on. And I do encourage you to go to our Facebook page. Just go to the homepage of Facebook. If you're a regular user, you'll know what I mean. Just type in facebook.com and you will gain access to the Facebook page. And then at the top, just go to the search box and type in the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, and you will have access to our Facebook page. And there, in order of most recent first, you will find the various postings that I've put on there in over the last several weeks and months. But you will find 4 or 5 that I've put on there over the last 2 or 3 days. Many of them related to the program we're into on corporations as Joel Bakken sees them, and some of the other issues. One of the postings that I put on early this morning related to our West Virginia political situation here. And of course, as many of you, most of you know, I am a candidate for elected office come this November, and consequently, I have to keep one eye posted at all times on the political situation here in West Virginia. And I don't know, those of you who aren't here, I don't know how much coverage this might be getting, because I know other states are going through fiscal crises of their own. But the one that West Virginia seems to be mired in right now, at least in the 25 years that I've been here, may be the most devastating. And again, a lot of people tend to attribute the entire situation to the decline in coal production. There's no question it has a major role to play in it. However, there are a number of other things that are contributing to this economic crisis, and I think it's very revealing, and it's very, very important, because the economy here is reeling, and a lot of people are, with reason, quite frightened about what the future might hold, not only for themselves, but for their children, for their families. We have called our legislature into special session because the regular 60-day session ended without a budget. And the governor promised, and indeed he did, call a special session of the legislature for the express purpose of passing a budget. And the reason the budget is such an issue is because the projected deficit in West Virginia is projected to be in the neighborhood of $270 million. And a lot of this is because of the decline in coal revenue, the severance taxes the states gets from natural gas extraction and from coal mining. The fact of the matter is there's much more to this than that. The previous legislature, last year's legislature enacted legislation which reduced corporate taxes significantly. The state's revenue declined as a result of this corporate tax cut by about $300 million. And with that tax cut came the decline in coal, the reduction in severance taxes. So the fact of the matter is, at the very time that West Virginia's economy was reeling and slowing down dramatically, the revenue it was scheduled to receive from its corporate citizens stopped coming in. And the result was that the size of the deficits were huge. And I think in order to be fair, I was going to use the word balance, but I don't like to use that because I think that word's been tainted a little bit, if you know what I mean. But the fact of the matter is, in order to be fair, the legislature that passed these tax cuts was not the current Republican-controlled legislature, but the outgoing Democratic legislature in 2013 and 2014. And the fact of the matter is, that's one of the issues here in West Virginia that I think is very significant. It's really a major reason why I chose to run. And that is that because of government's inclination in West Virginia to support business, to support corporations, both parties have done it. And so the fact of the matter is, the priorities of both parties became somewhat similar because the drumbeat was pretty much being dictated by business, especially in this state by coal. And so the fact of the matter is, many people would openly admit and acknowledge that in West Virginia there's very little difference between Republicans and Democrats. And the fact of the matter is, that's somewhat true. When I moved here as a Democrat, as a lifelong Democrat, it took me a long time to come to grips with the fact that those in this state who called themselves Democrats were not people that I saw as traditional Democrats. In places that I've been before, they would be Republicans because their priorities were to support business, were to support tax cuts, were to support balanced budgets, and all the rest of it. In other words, the idea of government's responsibility to the public at large, to the public interest, so to speak, which I see as a hallmark of the mission of the Democratic Party, pretty much was not visible here in West Virginia at all. And in fact, 2 years ago, when one of the elected Democrats to the state Senate, after the vote ended up in a tie for the Senate between Republicans and Democrats, one of the elected Democrats switched parties, became a Republican, which gave a one vote advantage to the Republicans in the Senate. That happened last year, and much of what's happened since then has flowed logically from that switch. And at the time he switched, when questioned on it, he made the point that as far as his constituents were concerned, it didn't matter whether he was a Democrat or Republican, because in West Virginia it makes no difference. And as disturbed as many people were by that comment that he made, the fact of the matter is, from my perspective, he seemed to be somewhat right. And one of the issues that has prompted me to run is because I believe that there is a difference, and I think it's time to reestablish and to dramatically make clear what that difference is. I think that's part of the problem, but that's another issue. The point of what I'm talking about here is that the economy is in crisis for a number of reasons. The inability or unwillingness of the legislature to diversify the economy, even though the end of coal prosperity was clearly coming. Everybody saw it. When I came here 25 years ago, newspapers were running editorials talking about the fact that coal production in West Virginia would flourish for the next 20 to 25 years. And then when all the cheapest coal to mine was gone, the prosperity would end. And it was imperative that the state make provisions for that and begin to diversify the economy. It never happened. And so, again, it's irrespective of party. That's one of the issues that I think is involved here. So the fact of the matter is there's quite a bit going on. And I basically feel the need to keep my finger on it, keep one eye on it at all times. So one of the postings that I put on Facebook this morning related specifically to that. There was an article, an editorial, or an op-ed piece actually, in this morning's Charleston Gazette. And it was co-authored by two officials of the West Virginia AFL-CIO. And it was, of course, a very critical article about the performance of the Republican majority in the special session. Because the fact of the matter is, today begins, this is a holiday week, of course, so the first session of the special session this week is today. So this is the third week that the special session has been operative. And as yet, there's no budget. There's no sign that there will be a budget. There seems to be a basic disagreements and discord between groups of people within the parties, and we don't seem to be getting anywhere on the budget. The president of the Senate has made the point that he has the Senate on hold, and they're going to wait until they get something to address from the House. The House of Delegates, on the other hand, can't seem to agree on anything. There seems to be a major split between those who want the entire deficit to be addressed in cuts, in agency cuts, in personnel layoffs, and in budget cuts. And then there's another constituency within the House that believes that we need to find ways to supplement revenue. The big issue on the table is an increase in the tax on cigarettes, on tobacco products, and another tax projected on cell phone usage. But again, as I believe I mentioned not too long ago on one of our programs, there is a group within the legislature, 26 members to be exact, not all of them Republicans, although most of them are, who signed the Grover Norquist pledge that under no conditions would they support a tax increase. This group has hunkered down to the point that those who advocate finding new revenue to help with the deficit are running headlong into this group of 26 that refuses to budge. The fact of the matter is then that the legislature is stymied, and the special session at a cost to the citizens of about $35,000 a day continues to go on day after day and accomplish darn little. In my mind, there's no question but that the real agenda here is not to find a way to negotiate a budget, but in fact, a desire not to. It is my feeling that the real agenda here, the hidden one, the one that you can't talk about, is to create the kind of fiscal crisis in the state that will force government to eliminate agencies, eliminate major numbers of state jobs, and really shrink the size of the state budget back to the size that many people believe it ought to be. I think that may be the agenda. It's not politically popular, so nobody acknowledges it. But the fact of the matter is, when you look at the behavior or lack of progress in the legislature, you can't help but wonder if there's something driving this that nobody seems to be able to put their finger on. And I think that that's it. It's not frustration at not being able to find negotiable points on which to build a budget. It's the fact that the real agenda on the part of key people is to create a fiscal crisis, bankrupt the state for purposes of eliminating all the fat out of the state budget and starting all over again. It's pretty drastic and pretty dire, but I would suggest to you that we see some of that on the federal level. It's not unheard of. It's not unprecedented. And I think it may be happening here. That would eliminate many of the programs, many of the costly social programs, if you will, in a state where the economy is in trouble anyway. That would do it, and it would do it very quickly. So we'll see. Anyway, I put an item on Facebook this morning which addressed that particular issue. It put a link on there to the article in the Gazette this morning and talked about some of the substance, some of the content of that article, which in my mind leads me to believe that the real agenda here, the article in the Gazette criticizes the lack of leadership in the legislature. The point that I tried to make is, in fact, the decision to come up with no budget is an agenda. And so, in effect, leading the state to fiscal crisis might be leadership. It's not the leadership that most people want, but it's leadership. It's taking us from where we are to where these people think we ought to be, whether, in fact, most of us want to go there or not. I don't know. I guess other states are going through similar situations. I have trouble believing that they would be quite as dramatic and quite as devastating as is happening in this state. But stay tuned, because I think that we're seeing this in various states as well. But again, our topic here at the Virtual Center, and I've pretty much consumed the better part of the first half hour of our program today, was on Joel Bakkun's book on corporations. Subtitle, or the rest of the title, The Pursuit of Profit and Power. And Joel Bakkun's thesis, as we learned yesterday, is that corporations as institutions exhibit, by their very nature, the behavior characteristics of psychopaths, of psychopathic human beings. And most of us are a little bit familiar with psychopathic behavior. Most of us have seen Silence of the Lambs. Most of us have experienced Anthony Hopkins as Hannibal Lecter. Most of us saw on the screen, portrayed in an award-winning portrayal, the characteristics of psychopathic behavior in the person of this character, played by Anthony Hopkins. That's what most of us know about a psychopath. There is no conscience. All human interactions are geared or driven by the need to manipulate the other. What always has to happen must benefit you, never anyone else. Your priorities must always be the ultimate outcome. In the course of doing that, then, right and wrong don't matter. Good and bad don't matter. All that matters is what works. Yesterday we connected it with the term Gesellschaft, which is the ideal society created by Ferdinand Tönnies in the 19th century in his book Gemeinschaft und Gesellschaft, the community and society, creating two ideal states in order to contrast the two. That's what Tönnies did. That's what we looked upon. As part of my research on this, I spent some time yesterday looking at the issue of psychopathic behavior. I'm not a psychologist. In fact, the more reading I did yesterday and last evening on this subject, the less I became quite glad that I'm not a psychologist. But one of the names that I came across in my reading intrigued me. The name I'm referring to is Dr. Robert Hare, H-A-R-E. Dr. Hare is Emeritus Professor of Psychology at the University of British Columbia. He's been there for 4 decades. And one of his contributions to the field of psychology was to create what is called in the field the Hare psychopathy checklist. In other words, a checklist of characteristics in order to measure the depth of psychopathic behavior. What Hare did was identify 20 characteristics. Each characteristic theoretically carried up to 2 points, depending on how strong it was in a particular individual. And by going through one characteristic after the other and assigning numerical values between 0.0 and 2.0, one can total it up and find out on a possible scale of 40, a total of 40 points, where one stood. The Hare checklist concluded that if a particular individual scored 30 or above, by totaling up the scores on all of these characteristics of psychopathic behavior, then one could be accurate in labeling this person a psychopath. Without getting into detail, I wanted to share this list with you here at the Virtual Center. And the reason I do this is not so much to look at the measurements and look at the scale. I'm not that much interested in an in-depth study of psychopathic behavior as such. My goal is to look in a little bit more depth than Joel Bakken does at the characteristics of psychopathic behavior in order to assess and evaluate his conclusion that corporations as institutions naturally exhibit these same characteristics. Obviously, because a corporation is not a person, in spite of what the law says, and we touched on that yesterday when we were looking at John Marshall's decision in Dartmouth College versus Woodward, and we'll be back to that, hopefully before the end of today's program. It remains clear that a corporation is not a human being. Consequently, we can't expect that it will exhibit all the behaviors of human beings. But I think you will agree with me, when I read this list, it became very clear to me that there is an awful lot of similarity between this list of 20 characteristics and the priorities of corporate behavior, at least as my reading has indicated that behavior to me. So with that, let me just share some of these, and I don't know that we have to go through all of them. I think we can move rather quickly through some of them. The first one which clearly relates to human beings more than corporations. Glib and superficial charm. The tendency to be smooth, engaging, charming, slick, verbally facile. Psychopathic charm is not in the least shy, nor is it self-conscious or afraid to say anything. A psychopath never gets tongue-tied. They have freed themselves from the social conventions about taking turns in talking, for example. Now you might say, well, that's good for people, for human beings, but what would it have to do with corporations? I would suggest to you that the similarity that I see there with corporations is in the area of public relations. Most corporations have put major resources into their public relations operation, into their advertising. Corporations give a lot of attention and devote a lot of revenue to their image, to branding, to efforts to convince the public at large that this corporation has a social conscience, that this corporation cares about people, cares about the environment, cares about the economy, cares about quality of life, cares about health care and educational levels and all the rest of it. In other words, most corporate PR efforts are driven by a desire to convince citizens that this corporation is what we would call a good citizen. It seems to me that it's not too much of a stretch to connect that directly to the characteristics of glib and superficial charm on the part of psychopathic human beings. The second characteristic on Dr. Robert Hare's list: grandiose self-worth. A grossly inflated view of one's abilities and one's self-worth. Self-assured, opinionated, cocky, a braggart. Psychopaths are arrogant people who believe that they are superior human beings. I can just hear people out there saying Donald Trump, Donald Trump, Donald Trump. We're not talking about Donald Trump today necessarily. We're talking about corporations. On the other hand, clearly, Donald Trump is a businessman. He makes that point all the time. He does things that business requires him to do. But at the same time, he does seek to paint this picture of himself as cocky, as opinionated, and as caring for people. Third characteristic: need for stimulation or proneness to boredom. An excessive need among psychopaths for novel, thrilling, exciting stimulation. Taking chances and doing things that are risky. Psychopaths often have low discipline in carrying tasks through to completion because they get bored. They fail to work at the same job for any length of time, or finish tasks that they consider dull or too routine. I don't know whether it would be too much of a stretch to connect corporations to that particular characteristics of the need for stimulation and proneness to boredom. But there's absolutely no question that corporations do everything they can do to bring attention to themselves and to constantly use every opportunity that comes up to make the point as to how socially relevant they are and how good a corporate citizen they are. The fourth characteristic on Hare's list: pathological lying. This can be moderate or it can be high. In moderate form, psychopaths will be shrewd, crafty, cunning, sly, clever. In extreme form, they will be deceptive, deceitful, underhanded, unscrupulous, manipulative, and dishonest. All of us will remember that in one of the debates, Ted Cruz specifically referred to Donald Trump as a pathological liar. Question: is this more personal? Is this a characteristic, at least in Cruz's mind, of Donald Trump? Or to what extent do corporations as institutions regularly engage in lying, in deceitfulness, in manipulating evidence? I'm thinking back to our programs on climate. I'm thinking back to the disinformation campaigns of major corporations who hired their own bank of scientists in order to find evidence to challenge regular science, to challenge the scientific community on what tobacco was doing to people's health, what burning fossil fuels was doing to the climate, what man was doing to the planet, all of it. One of the things that we found, absolutely without question, is that major corporations, and we named several, ExxonMobil and Phillips and BP, and we went through a whole bunch. There is absolutely no question that these corporations engaged in lying. Could one claim that because they are corporations, that lying is pathological? In other words, to them, it's not lying. It's just the way you have to do business. Because the requirements, the priorities of the corporation demand it. Joe Bakken makes the point, we talked about it yesterday, that the number one priority of corporations is to take care of and satisfy their shareholders. That has to be at the top of the list always. And Bakken makes the point that any effort by corporations to convince the general public that that's not true, and that they are corporate good citizens, and that they do have a social conscience, and that they do care about people, and do care about the environment, and all of that, chances are a lot of that is PR, is lying. Because the fact of the matter is, corporations will do what the needs or the prospective needs of their shareholders demand that they do. The next characteristic, conning and manipulativeness. The use of deceit and deception to cheat, con, or defraud others for personal gain. Distinguished from number 4, pathological lying, in the degree to which exploitation and callous ruthlessness is present, as reflected in a lack of concern for the feeling and the suffering of one's victims. Conning and manipulating the evidence, the facts, the image, all of it. Putting out lies as truth. Claiming that something is scientific evidence when it's not. Claiming that you have countervailing evidence disproving what scientists say is proof that is not. And on and on and on. Next characteristic, lack of remorse or guilt. A lack of feelings or concern for the feelings and suffering of one's victims. Lack of feelings or concerns for the losses, pain, and suffering of victims. A tendency to be unconcerned, dispassionate, cold-hearted, non-empathetic. This item is usually demonstrated by a disdain for one's victims. The way you deal with this is to find some justification for blaming the victim. Poverty. The reason that we have trouble finding anti-poverty programs that work is because poor people won't play by the rules. They won't do what they're supposed to do. We'll give them the revenue, or we'll give them the support or the resources that they need. But on the other hand, we demand that their behavior change. And if it won't, we can't afford to keep throwing good money after bad. In other words, this is a way to blame the victim. And that's tied directly with the idea of a lack of remorse or guilt. The next one, shallow affect. Emotional poverty or a limited range of depth of feelings. Interpersonal coldness in spite of signs of open gregariousness. In other words, you can't afford to get too close. The next one, callousness and lack of empathy. A lack of feelings toward people in general. Cold, contemptuous, inconsiderate, tactless. The kind of impersonal, dispassionate way that corporations deal with human beings. The big issue we focus on is the extent to which the courts have tried to convince us that corporations are people, at least legally. But the fact of the matter is, the counter to that always is that corporations don't have a conscience. And this callousness and lack of empathy is evidence of that. The next characteristic, parasitic lifestyle. An intentional, manipulative, selfish, exploitative financial dependence on others as reflected in a lack of motivation, low self-discipline, and inability to begin or complete responsibilities. The extent to which psychopaths tend to be parasites. They tend to attach themselves to other people and expect other people to take care of them. Do corporations do that? There's no question that corporations do that when it comes to tax law and the rest of it, in terms of making sure that they get favorable breaks when it comes to passing tax legislation and other things. Poor behavioral controls. Expressions of irritability, annoyance, impatience, threats, aggression, verbal abuse, inadequate control of anger and temper, acting hastily. The extent to which corporations overreact to negative situations. One of the things that just occurred to me, and I don't know which of these characteristics it would apply to, but I'm thinking specifically here in West Virginia of an organization that was founded some years ago called the Friends of Coal. And this is a PR initiative on the part of coal to enlist West Virginia citizens, all of them, into the idea that the government's attack on coal and on emission standards, which is crippling our economy and costing so many people their jobs and their health care, is aimed at all citizens, not just the corporations. In other words, the extent to which the corporation goes to great lengths to convince the citizens that attacks on it are attacks on them. Early behavior problems. This is obviously related to human beings. a variety of behaviors prior to the age of 13, et cetera, et cetera. A lack of realistic long-term goals, an inability or persistent failure to develop and execute long-term plans and goals, a nomadic existence, aimless, lacking direction in life. I would suggest that how corporations would connect to this idea of a lack of realistic long-term goals is that realistically corporations have trouble responding to the priorities of their shareholders and planning for the long term at the same time. Shareholders are looking for immediate profit, for bottom line evidence that their investments are paying off. Therefore, corporations must be managed in such a way that they generate that kind of data in order to satisfy those kinds of priorities. Those priorities are short term, not long term. So the irony of the situation is that while corporations encourage citizens to look long term and to invest in the market long term, the fact of the matter is their priorities are usually short term. I'm skipping a couple of these because they clearly don't apply. Here's one: irresponsibility. Repeated failure to fulfill or honor obligations and commitments, such as not paying bills, defaulting on loans, performing sloppy work, being absent or late to work, failing to honor contractual agreements and obligations. I think this would raise serious questions. But the other thing I'm thinking of is the number of suits that have been filed by the Securities and Exchange Commission and other groups where corporations have been paying in the last several years huge fines, provided that they don't have to admit guilt. So basically the assumption is I can pay my way out of being guilty of anything wrong. And I think that's quite significant. Failure to accept responsibility for your own actions. A failure to accept responsibility for one's actions reflected in low conscientiousness, absence of dutifulness, antagonistic manipulation, denial of responsibility, an effort to manipulate others through this denial. I think we've already addressed that. And then the next ones clearly relate to people: revocation of conditional release, juvenile delinquency, and all the rest of it. The point I'm making is these 20 characteristics of Dr. Robert Hare are the defining characteristics on his scale for measuring the depth of psychopathic behavior. But one of the things that occurred to me is that there's too much similarity between many of the specific characteristics on that list, and the priorities and behavior characteristics of corporations generally. And I think this is critical for us to emphasize. What Joel Bakken emphasizes throughout his study, and I think what all of us need to appreciate and keep in mind, is that what we are talking about here is corporations as institutions. We're not talking about the particular CEO of the corporation. We're not talking about the ethics or the morality of the person in charge. We're talking instead about the institutional requirements of the organization as an institution, what it must do in order to fulfill its obligations to its own charter, to what led to its incorporation in the first place. Government gave it legal standing as a legal person, and for this we can go back, and we will in a moment, to John Marshall. Government gave this corporation a legal standing, a legal existence, because government believed that what this corporation aimed to do was to provide a service that was considered to be in the public interest. What this corporation promised was to deliver something that society would benefit from. And on the basis of that, in the name of the citizens it represents, government chartered that corporation as a legal entity. It has obligations to carry out those responsibilities. But in order to make its responsibilities possible, in order to help it meet those responsibilities, corporations must raise money, large amounts of money. The value of corporations as a structure, as an organization, is their ability to raise huge amounts of capital. And the way they do that is by selling shares, selling the ownership of the company in pieces, and assigning a value to each piece. So, for example, 1,000 shares in General Electric is worth X. 1,000 shares in Walmart, 5,000 shares in Walmart, 50,000 shares in Walmart. And the more valuable the corporation becomes, in other words, the more revenue it generates, the more profit it brings to its shareholders, the more value there is to its stock, and the more likely more people are to invest in it. In order to do that, corporations must be independent. They can't be overregulated. Because in order to carry out the responsibilities for which the corporation was created, it's got to be allowed to operate freely and independently in order to have a chance to accomplish the purposes for which it was created. And that's where we were at the end of yesterday's program. John Marshall, in his Dartmouth College versus Woodward decision in 1819, was explaining government's rationale in chartering a corporation. And of course, the particular corporation in question here is Dartmouth College. And I think most of us know, but I'm sure there are people who don't. And this is a fault of mine. I didn't take the time yesterday to provide any background at all on Dartmouth College, the Dartmouth College case. So I don't know how much sense this makes. In other words, if you don't understand the circumstances and what the case is about, then the case itself doesn't mean anything. So I thought that what I might do today for 5 minutes or so is just sketch the background in order to put this case in context. Originally, during the colonial period, New Hampshire was created as one of the original 13 colonies. All 13 colonies, theoretically, were under the control of the king. The proprietors of the colony of New Hampshire decided that the people of New Hampshire would benefit by the creation of a college. The principal purpose of this college, of Dartmouth College, was in large part to educate Indians, to try to do something to bring Indians into the mainstream of colonial development. So the purposes of chartering Dartmouth College are somewhat unique in that score, on that score. It's one of the few institutions or corporations that was created specifically to address the issue of educating Native Americans. Be that as it may, the king granted a charter to Dartmouth College, created it as an independent educational institution. The word used at the time was eleemosynary. In my mind, it means educational. An eleemosynary institution would be an institution to educate citizens, educate people. It was a private institution. And what that means is it was a private corporation. It was owned by the shareholders, by the investors. And that meant that the shareholders expected to derive a profit from their investments. So by definition, the operation of the institution was expected to generate a profit. In other words, the bottom line was critical. And the only way that the college could make money, could raise capital, was to bring in more investors, which means to sell more shares. And the only way people are going to buy the shares is if the prospects for profit are positive. So that pretty well defined the priorities of the institution. While the job of the institution was to educate Indians, that's the reason the state issued the charter in the first place. The fact of the matter is the corporation's real priorities were to raise the revenue necessary to fulfill the institution's mission. And that meant satisfying the shareholders. That meant generating profit in order to attract more investors. If those two things ever came into conflict, the desire to educate Indians as well as other citizens versus the desire to generate profit for the shareholders, according to Joel Barkan, by definition, the shareholders must always win. Their priorities must always take precedence. That's the background of Dartmouth College. Fact of the matter is the American War for Independence happened. New Hampshire became an independent state. And after the so-called Revolution of 1800, New Hampshire, along with many other states, fell out of the control of the Federalist Party supporting President George Washington, and the legislature was taken over by Jeffersonian Republicans. And the whole idea of Jeffersonian Republicans was to look at the existence of Dartmouth College and begin to appreciate the fact that if the legislature took control of the college, it could reshape, redirect the college and the mission of the college to much more beneficial services to citizens. In other words, the legislature set out to take control of the college away from the shareholders and turn it over to the legislature, which in theory meant the citizens of New Hampshire were taking control. And the shareholders sued. And the case ended up in the Supreme Court. And one of Dartmouth's most distinguished alumni, Daniel Webster, defended the institution before the Supreme Court. And in his decision, Marshall declared that for the state of New Hampshire to take control of the college away from the shareholders violated a contract, that the charter from the king to the shareholders was a contract. And even though the government had changed, the contract remains valid. And therefore, the Supreme Court denied the state of New Hampshire its initiative to take control of Dartmouth College. And as many of us know, today Dartmouth College remains a private institution. It remains one of the members of the Ivy League. And I'm thinking quickly, but it seems to me almost all, if not all, of the members of the Ivy League are private institutions. Princeton, Yale, Harvard, Cornell, Dartmouth, etc. Anyway, that's the background. That's the political situation that caused Marshall to render his opinion in this particular case. And in the course of rendering his opinion, Marshall reminds us that Dartmouth College is a corporation. And when the king created that corporation, legitimized that corporation with its own charter, the king was declaring that the intentions of the shareholders, the intentions of the corporation, were to provide services that the king believed the state of New Hampshire would benefit from. That was the contract. And then Marshall begins to explain what being a corporation requires in order to fulfill the obligations of its contract. And that's where we were yesterday. Marshall said that a corporation possesses only those properties which the charter of its creation confers upon it, either expressly or as incidental to its very existence. Translation: the corporation is entitled to whatever properties it needs in order to fulfill the terms of its charter, the reasons for its creation. And then Marshall identifies them. This is right where we stopped yesterday. Among the most important of these properties, he says, are immortality and, if the expression may be allowed, individuality. Properties by which a perpetual succession of many persons are considered as the same and may act as a single individual. What Marshall is saying here in this paragraph is that two of the principal properties corporations must have is immortality, the right to prepare and act in behalf of their own future success and existence. Institutions have the right to perpetuate themselves. Institutions have the right to do whatever is necessary in order to keep the institution alive and flourishing, because only then will the services promised in the charter be delivered. So by definition, no corporation is going to be chartered whose goal is to disappear, cease to exist. So by definition, corporations must continue to exist in order to continue to fulfill the terms of their charter or their contract. Therefore, among the most important properties that corporations are entitled to is immortality. The second one that Marshall identified is their individuality. Their right to be treated as an individual entity, not as a corporation amongst a whole other group of corporations. Corporations become, Marshall is saying here, legal persons. It's as if they were a person, a legal person. And so Marshall spells this out by saying that individuality means that there may be a perpetual succession of many persons who run the corporation and who'll invest in it. They're all the same. Therefore, they may act as a single individual. So in a sense, what you are doing is assigning legal personhood to the corporation. The question that I left with us yesterday, ended the program with yesterday, is to spend time thinking about immortality and individuality together as the two properties that Marshall identifies as key properties of a corporation. The right to govern itself with its own future immortality in mind, its own success, its own perpetual existence, and at the same time, its individuality. If the corporation is to be viewed as a legal person, then theoretically, if a major property of corporations is its individuality, then wherever appropriate, corporations, Marshall seems to be saying, ought to have the same rights, the same protections, and the same opportunities as any other individual, as any other person. That means that there are certain things that government can't do. If corporations are to maintain their own individuality, that means they have the right to manage themselves, not to be managed from outside, not to be overregulated or overmanaged. By definition, if their individuality is a priority, then their freedom is a priority. Their freedom to act and to behave in their own interests in order to do whatever they feel they must do to ensure their own immortality. In other words, what Marshall has done, it seems to me, by linking individuality with immortality, is issue corporations an incredible legal gift. The right to do whatever they feel they need to do in order to ensure their own immortality. That means effectively that they must be shielded from, protected from, overregulation and management from outside. They must be allowed to function independently. What Marshall has done in terms of Dartmouth College is to lay the groundwork for the argument that the state of New Hampshire should have no right to come in and take control of this institution and redirect its priorities when the original contract gave the institution itself the freedom and the independence to pursue its own goals in its own way. In a sense, in the short term, what Marshall has done here is make the case for the preservation of the independence of Dartmouth College as a private institution. But if you take this case out of context and you look at it as legal precedent for corporations, then what Marshall has done is assign corporations the same freedom, the same individuality that human beings have as persons. All the rights and freedoms of persons under the Bill of Rights. The right to do whatever its managers, its officers deem that it should do in order to fulfill the terms of its original charter, and in the process to ensure its own future, its own immortality. What Marshall has done, it seems to me, is establish legal precedent for corporate personhood, for Citizens United, for the 14th Amendment, for the, more specifically for the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment. No person can be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. That was in the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution, the Bill of Rights. It applied only to the federal government when it said no government no person shall be deprived by the federal government. The Fifth Amendment applied only to the federal government. The 14th Amendment transferred that application to the states. The goal in the 1860s, theoretically, was to protect the rights and freedom of ex-slaves from state governments, using the agencies of the federal government to protect individuals and their freedom within their own states. But the existence of corporate personhood meant that those same protections would also go to corporations. And that's what we're seeing in Citizens United. That's what we're seeing in the Hobby Lobby case. That's what we're seeing in state after state, that this past session passed religious freedom restoration legislation, which in effect gave people the right to use religion to discriminate against, to not serve people that they claimed their religion forbade them to serve. If a baker decided that it was against his scruples to bake a cake for a wedding of two gays, then to make that person bake that cake would infringe upon the religious freedom of the baker. That's the implication of these religious restoration pieces of legislation that are now underway in North Carolina and several other states. We fought it out here during the session in West Virginia as well. Basically, if you wanted to turn that around, you could say that what the advocates for this legislation are claiming is that if you interfere with my right to discriminate, you're violating my religious freedom. Because my religion gives me the right to serve or not serve whomever I want. here we are in John Marshall, 1819, considering many of the same issues. It's just, to me, it's just mind-blowing. It's fabulous when you think about this. Marshall goes on then, after he mentions immortality and individuality, and talks about these properties. And he says these properties enable a corporation to manage its own affairs and to hold property without the perplexing intricacies, the hazardous and endless necessity of perpetual conveyances for the purpose of transmitting it from hand to hand. In other words, by definition, when you define a corporation as a legal person, then you are assuming that that person has property rights, the same property rights that any person, any human being would have. So it gives the corporation the right to own property and to have that property respected. As Marshall said, as James Madison said in Federalist Number 10, the major cause of factions revolves around the different ownership of property. Marshall goes on and says, it is chiefly for the purpose of clothing bodies of men in succession with these qualities and capacities that corporations were invented and are in use. By these means, a perpetual succession of individuals are capable of acting for the promotion of the particular object like one immortal being. Marshall is saying here that for purposes of the law, in constitutions, generation after generation of the officers of a corporation constitute one legal person and must be treated as such by the government, by law. But then Marshall qualifies it a little bit and says, this being, this person that's created, this legal person, does not share in the civil government of the country unless that be the purpose for which it was created. Its immortality no more confers on it political power or a political person or a political character than immortality would confer such power on or character on a natural person. In other words, it's important to keep the corporation separate from government and not allow the corporation to make laws. So Marshall is walking a fine line here between the power and influence of corporations on the one hand and the extent to which they cannot or ought not participate in the creation that. Now Marshall takes this case into the area of education and points out that a corporation which is created with properties to pursue or to perpetuate its own immortality and to practice its own individuality and its own independence does not become an employee of the state. This person, this legal corporation that was created, does not become a state employee or a state official because the state chooses to change the nature of the contract. And so what Marshall is doing is laying the groundwork for the decision which will protect and defend the independence of Dartmouth College from a state takeover. That's the issue. And these are some of the matters, some of the issues that Joel Bakken raises in his book on corporations and the extent to which they exhibit, by definition as institutions, the aspects of psychopathic behavior. I've taken 3 quotations or 3 statements from Bakken's book. Let me share them with you because I think they'll make sense now. And as we move toward the end of our program, we've got about 12 minutes left in today's program. I think if you reflect on these quotations, they pretty well sum up what Bakken's case is. And I want to pursue this again tomorrow in a totally different direction in the terms of the nature of corporations. Bakken says this: the corporation is, as it always has been, a product of public policy, a creation of the state. This is important. A corporation, as it always has been, must be and is a creation of the state. The state is the only institution in the world that can bring a corporation to life. It alone grants corporations their essential rights, such as legal personhood and limited liability. And it compels them always to put profits first. It raises police forces and armies and builds courthouses and prisons, all compulsorily paid for by citizens, to enforce corporations' property rights, rights themselves created by the state. Let me repeat that because that's a little bit complicated, but it's very, very important. He says the state and only the state can create a corporation. He's still talking about the state, and he says it raises police forces and armies and builds courthouses and prisons to enforce, to protect corporations' property rights, rights that themselves were created by the state. By making the corporation a person, the state made it eligible and legally entitled to own property. And the officers of the state then are required to defend that property, which the state gave them in the first place. And only the state, in conjunction with other states, can enter into international trade deals and create global institutions such as the World Trade Organization that in turn limit its ability to regulate the corporations and the property rights it has created. Think about that. The state creates the corporation. The state entitles the corporation to become a legal person. The state, therefore, entitles the corporation to own property. The state, therefore, has the same responsibilities to protect the private property of corporations as it does to protect the private property of citizens. And in turn, the state can enter into international agreements with other nations that can limit the state's ability to regulate corporations and the property rights it has created. Think about that. The state creates the corporation. The state is responsible for the property rights. The state is responsible for protecting the property rights of corporations. The state engages in the kinds of international agreements which basically may limit the right of the state to regulate the corporations and the property rights that it has created. Pretty complicated. But it sounds pretty good for corporations. I think we're beginning to get a sense as to where corporate power and corporate influence in America come from. Another quote from Bakken's book. The corporation is an externalizing machine in the same way that a shark is a killing machine. There isn't any question of malevolence or of will. The enterprise has within it, and the shark has within it, those characteristics that enable it to do that for which it is designed, unquote. Translation: a shark is born and a shark is driven by certain internal priorities that we can't do anything about. The shark is a killing machine. It will kill. We can't change it. We can't train the shark not to be a killer. Likewise, Bakken is saying, we can't teach the corporation to be anything but what it is either. It must be what it was designed to be, which is a profit motivator, a capital generator that rewards shareholders. That's what it's about. And Bakken's point is you can't change that. And then he gets to the issue that we talked about a little bit yesterday. We haven't talked that much about it today as yet. And this is the issue of self-control. No one, Bakken said, would seriously argue that individuals should regulate themselves, that laws against murder, assault, and theft are unnecessary because people are socially responsible. Nobody would say that. Abolish all the laws regulating murder and theft and everything else because people are socially responsible. They ought to be allowed to do their own thing. Nobody would argue for that, Bakken says. Yet, oddly, we are asked to believe that corporate persons, institutional psychopaths, who lack any sense of moral conviction and who have the power and the motivation to cause harm and devastation in the world, should be left free to govern themselves. Unquote. What Bakken is talking about is the absurdity of the contradiction. We created it as a legal person, yet at the same time, we're willing to give it much more freedom, much more flexibility to operate than we are human persons. We assume that by its will, the corporation will become socially responsible, will become a corporate good citizen. Therefore, we don't have to regulate it. We shouldn't regulate it because we would be interfering with their individuality and their pursuit of their own immortality. But the fact of the matter is, we're deceiving ourselves, is what Bakken is saying. We've reached the end of our program today. I think this stuff is fascinating. Tomorrow, what I'd like to do is consider this a little bit further. And I'd like to go into the matter of corporate behavior in a little bit more depth. I've run across a few things that I think many of you will find interesting. I know I did. And I know that this story of the week, this focus on corporations, will not be complete without putting tomorrow's program into this as part of the package. Thank you for tuning in to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution today. I hope you have a wonderful evening. Be kind to each other, and thank you.